What if the walls of abandoned asylums could speak? What secrets would they tell? Would they whisper of madness, or of something far more disturbing? Entire families locked away, erased from history, their very blood declared unfit to touch the world outside? Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tonight we open doors that were meant to stay sealed, deep within the crumbling ruins of America's state institutions, Fernald, Pennhurst, and others whose names history has tried to forget. We uncover a hidden war fought not against disease, but against heredity itself. Here, families were not admitted as patients, but catalogued as bloodlines. They were sterilized, experimented on, and confined for generations, their names scratched into peeling paint as the only testimony left behind. As you watch, I want you to pause for a moment and take part in this investigation with us. Write in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is right now. It matters, because history like this is not bound to one place or 1 hour. It lingers everywhere, across continents and across time. And if you find this story unsettling but important, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It is your way of helping Gothic Ledger unearth what the archives have tried to bury. What you are about to hear is not folklore. It is a record of files destroyed, families erased, and photographs that should not exist. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, one question will remain. If these programs were meant to end, why does the last surviving document bear a date from only 5 years ago? In 1978, a small team of state investigators walked through the hushed corridors of Fernald State School, a place long abandoned yet unwilling to let go of its shadows. The air clung to them, stale, heavy with mildew, carrying the faint metallic scent of rusted locks and rotting pipes. Every door they passed was a reminder of how tightly silence had been held here, how carefully memory had been boarded shut. Fernald was once described as a school, but its true identity was always closer to a prison. Founded in the early 20th century at the height of America's eugenics fervor, it was designed less to educate than to contain. The people who ended up here were not chosen for what they had done, but for who they were, or more precisely for who their parents had been. Generations labeled feeble-minded, defective, or unfit were transferred into these brick walls and expected never to leave. As the investigators entered a northern wing that had been sealed since the 1950s, their lantern beams illuminated a sight that disturbed even the most hardened among them. Along the flaking plaster, carved into the paint itself, were names connected by branching lines, crude genealogies scratched with spoons, nails, or whatever fragments of metal the patients could smuggle, stretched across the walls like veins. 5 generations of a single bloodline, marked in cramped lettering, were etched into surfaces that had once been painted white. It was not the work of a single hand. The lettering shifted from generation to generation, different strokes, different depths, each link carved by those who came after, trapped within the same asylum as their mothers, their uncles, their cousins. It was the record of a family that never left, condemned not by crime, but by blood. The carvings revealed what official archives tried to hide. Fernald did not merely admit individuals, it absorbed entire genealogies. Children were born inside its wards and never permitted to leave. Their children followed, each new generation placed beneath the same roof, inheriting not only a name, but a confinement that the state called protection. The walls bore witness to what paper files omitted, the systematic imprisonment of bloodlines under the guise of science. Standing before these walls, the investigators recognized the silent defiance in the carvings. Records had been destroyed, files misplaced, reports rewritten, but the families had written themselves into the structure itself. What bureaucrats erased, the trapped inscribed with desperate precision. The result was less a family tree than a warning. the lineage of captivity itself. The Fernald State School was supposed to represent order and improvement, a monument to society's ambition to purge defectiveness. Yet within its abandoned wings, the truth had remained intact, etched into plaster and paint. It was not the names themselves that haunted the room. It was the implication that entire families had been absorbed by an institution that existed to ensure their blood never touched the world outside. The walls remembered what the archives tried to erase: 5 generations of a single name trapped within the same asylum. At the dawn of the 20th century, America stood at the crossroads of science and ideology. But the path chosen was not one of compassion. It was a path defined by calculation and elimination. In universities, lecture halls, and legislative chambers, the language of heredity became the language of purity, and purity was treated not as an ideal, but as a mandate. Eugenics promised a future in which society would be scrubbed clean of weakness. Its advocates described poverty, disability, and mental illness not as conditions of circumstance, but as permanent stains etched into family lines. The so-called feeble-minded became both diagnosis and verdict. With a single phrase, generations could be condemned, families marked as defective and therefore expendable. Institutions like Fernald, Pennhurst, and countless state hospitals became the machinery by which this vision was enforced. Families were examined not as individuals, but as genealogies, their supposed faults mapped across charts that reduced human lives to heredity diagrams. If a child struggled in school, if a parent was deemed unstable, if relatives had fallen into poverty, these became threads woven into a larger tapestry of defectiveness. Entire families were classified, institutionalized, and sterilized in the name of progress. The cold efficiency of the system was hidden beneath the language of improvement. Sterilization laws, first passed in Indiana in 1907 and replicated across dozens of states, promised to shield the nation from inherited weakness. Legislators called it prevention, doctors called it treatment. In practice, it was neither. It was a bureaucratic erasure of bloodlines that were deemed to weaken the state. Beneath official rhetoric lay a quiet relentlessness. The tests administered to children, puzzles, vocabulary lists, crude examinations of intelligence, were not designed to measure potent. They were designed to confirm inferiority. The label feeble-minded became self-fulfilling. Once applied, it justified confinement, sterilization, and the silencing of testimony. It stripped away any chance of recognition as a full citizen or even as a person. The obsession with purity was not confined to academic debate. It marched into courtrooms where judges signed orders of sterilization. It appeared in newspapers where public fear of degeneration was stoked by warnings of unfit families draining the strength of the nation. It crept into policy where welfare, education, and health systems were weaponized to identify and sequester those marked as undesirable. In this climate, asylums swelled not with the dangerous, but with the inconvenient. Families too poor to resist, too stigmatized to defend themselves, were absorbed into institutions that transformed theories into daily punishment. The weight of heredity became a chain heavier than any iron bar, binding parents to children, children to grandchildren, all branded by the same label. Behind locked doors, America declared war not on disease, but on heredity itself. The prisons of purity were built in plain sight, their justifications written into law, their victims catalogued by generation. What began as an ideology soon calcified into policy, and policy became practice, one that consumed entire bloodlines under the pretense of protecting the future. The records that remain refer to them only as the K family. The surname has been lost, or more likely deliberately erased, leaving behind only fragments scattered across medical charts, sterilization petitions, and faded intake logs. Yet the outline of their story is clear enough. 5 generations of the same bloodline confined within the walls of state institutions, each inheriting not a legacy of crime, but the stigma of heredity. The family's origins were rural, settled in a stretch of farmland where isolation blurred the lines of kinship. By the 1910s, whispers of inbreeding reached county officials, amplified by neighbors who spoke less of individual faults than of a collective strangeness. A child who stammered, an uncle prone to silence, a grandmother who grew forgetful too early. These traits, taken separately, would have drawn little notice. Together they were woven into a narrative of defectiveness. The first members of the K family admitted to Fernald were not accused of violence nor of neglect. They were admitted because they shared a name. The diagnosis was hereditary, the cure institutional. Their intake files read like genealogical charts rather than medical notes, arrows connecting siblings to parents, dotted lines stretching toward cousins. The asylum's language betrayed its purpose. Families were not patients, but case studies, units of heredity to be confined and observed. By the 1930s, 3 generations of the family had been absorbed into the institution. Children born inside its walls never saw freedom. Some were sterilized before adolescence, their bodies altered without consent to ensure the bloodline could not extend beyond the gates. The justification was written in clinical shorthand: inbred, feeble-minded, unfit. Each word functioned not as description, but as sentence, sealing their fates long before they could speak for themselves. Tragedy deepened as the decades passed. By the mid-century, reports mention 4th and 5th generation members of the same family, institutionalized from birth. They were not given the chance to fail or succeed in the outside world. Their existence was assumed defective from the moment their names appeared on intake rosters. Their individuality dissolved into a single case file, a single symbol of what the eugenics movement sought to contain. The family tree carved into the asylum wall, the one investigators found in 1978, bore their marks most clearly. Branches traced across the plaster revealed the persistence of memory where archives had failed. Different hands, different years, yet the same lineage repeating, generation after generation. It was the K family's own record, scratched into stone, defying erasure, even as official files grew thinner and names disappeared. They were not admitted as patients. They were catalogued as bloodlines. The K family became less a family than an exhibit, evidence in a campaign against imperfection. Their lives were consumed not by illness, but by a system that mistook ancestry for crime. And when the walls finally emptied, their surname was gone, their legacy confined to carvings, fragments, and silence. The machinery of confinement was built not only from walls and locks, but from paper. Within the offices of America's state schools and asylums, bureaucrats and physicians devised charts, diagrams, and tests that transformed families into data. Misery was translated into measurements, and heredity into hieroglyphs of defectiveness. By the 1910s, intelligence testing had become the favored instrument of control. Imported from Europe and adapted into English, the early IQ test was wielded less as a measure of learning than as a verdict of worth. Scores were stripped of context, poverty, malnutrition, language barriers, and presented as immutable evidence of inherited weakness. A child who hesitated over a word or puzzled too long at a shape was catalogued as feeble-minded, a classification that extended backward to parents and outward to siblings. Administrators drew family charts with mechanical precision. Names appeared in boxes connected by lines, annotated with symbols that denoted epilepsy, illiteracy, poverty, or mental deficiency. The charts resembled genealogical trees, but their branches were pruned not by nature, but by prejudice. The presence of one labeled defect in a lineage was enough to brand the entire bloodline. Families ceased to be collections of individuals. They became diagrams of failure, destined for confinement. The process was clinical in appearance, but arbitrary in practice. A mother who struggled to read was marked defective, her children labeled at risk. A father, unable to hold steady employment, was deemed unstable. His extended family entered into the record as degenerate stock. The criteria were elastic, designed to confirm suspicion rather than to test it. The charts grew denser, each new annotation a justification for sterilization or institutionalization. Inside these diagrams, the individuality of the confined vanished. People were reduced to symbols, a square filled with black ink signifying feeble-minded male, a circle shaded to mark insane female. A page of paper could erase a lifetime of possibility. And when presented to legislators or funding boards, these diagrams carried the weight of science. The precision of the lines, the clinical appearance of the symbols, obscured the fact that entire families were being condemned by speculation. The atmosphere within the institutions mirrored the sterility of the charts. Daily routines became exercises in measurement, puzzles to be solved, words to be repeated, tasks to be performed under watchful eyes. The data collected rarely improved the lives of those tested. It merely reinforced the records already written. Test results confirmed the conclusions drawn in advance, that defectiveness was permanent, transmissible, and best contained. Through this pseudoscience, heredity was transformed into destiny. Poverty became proof of degeneracy. Stammering became evidence of weakness. Isolation became a symptom of disease. The logic was circular, but the consequences were absolute. Families entered asylums not through conviction or illness, but through the diagrams that reduced them to defective stock. They believed misery could be measured, graphed, and institutionalized, and on the strength of those charts, generations vanished into the wards, their humanity replaced by symbols inked into bureaucratic paper. Pennhurst stood as a sprawling complex of red brick and iron gates, a place that in official records was called a state school, but in practice resembled a fortress of abandonment. Founded in 1908 in Pennsylvania, it was intended as a refuge for those deemed feeble-minded. Instead, it became an archive of human neglect. By the mid-20th century, thousands of men, women, and children were confined within its walls, not as patients in need of care, but as bodies warehoused to be forgotten. Inside, the conditions were stripped of any pretense of treatment. Reports describe wards where dozens of children lay strapped to benches for hours, their limbs contorted from lack of movement. Toilets overflowed, and the stench of human waste clung to the air. One visitor recalled rats moving freely through the dormitories. Another described children sleeping on floors, their blankets soaked with urine. Administrators called it housing. Former staff called it survival. The courts, much later, would call it cruelty. Families who were institutionalized together found no solace in proximity. Parents and children were separated into different wards, often never reunited. Siblings grew up as strangers across locked hallways. Generations carried the same surname, but were scattered in different wings, reduced to numbers on rosters. For many, their only inheritance was the institutional regime, scheduled feedings, forced silence, and the rhythm of discipline. By the 1960s, Pennhurst housed more than 2,700 individuals, far beyond its intended capacity. With one attendant often responsible for over 100 patients, the line between care and punishment vanished. Neglect became structural, discipline became mechanical. In interviews, survivors later described beatings for speaking out of turn, punishments for attempting to escape, and the unspoken rule that silence meant safety. The illusion of treatment shattered publicly in 1968, when a televised exposé revealed the horrors within Pennhurst. Viewers saw rows of children rocking endlessly, their eyes vacant, their bodies wasted by neglect. The public response was outrage, but the system persisted. True reckoning came only a decade later, in the Haldeman versus Pennhurst lawsuit. Brought forward in 1974 by Terry Lee Haldeman, a young woman who had endured both neglect and assault within the institution, the case became a turning point. Testimonies and photographs laid bare conditions that had been long denied. Patients, lawyers, and investigators described the facility as unfit for animals, a phrase that entered the official record. Judges determined that Pennhurst had violated basic constitutional rights, acknowledging that confinement had been punishment disguised as care. The lawsuit forced the slow dismantling of Pennhurst, but for the generations trapped inside, justice came too late. Decades had been consumed by silence and suffering. The institution's walls, once built to contain, now stood as evidence of what a society could justify in the name of purity. At Pennhurst, even survival was indistinguishable from punishment. The asylum did not heal, it endured, and within its rotting corridors families were reduced not to patience, but to proof that a system of cruelty could sustain itself for generations. Within the walls of America's state institutions, the cycle of confinement reproduced itself. Families admitted as defective did not simply vanish into dormitories, they persisted, generation after generation, beneath the same roof. Children were born inside these walls, delivered not into homes, but into wards where their futures were already decided. Their first breath was accompanied by paperwork, their names entered into ledgers that labeled them at risk before they could open their eyes. These children grew up under the weight of observation. From infancy, they were measured, catalogued, and examined for signs of the hereditary defect that had condemned their parents. Each delay in speech, each difficulty with memory, each unusual gesture was noted as evidence. Their play was supervised, their movements recorded, their laughter rare. They belonged not to their families, but to the institution, which regarded them as living proof of genetic failure. Unlike orphans, who might be adopted, or patients, who might be discharged, these children carried a surname that functioned like a sentence. Intake logs reveal the repetition of names across decades. The same families entered again and again, their branches confined to a single location. Surnames outlasted the children themselves, echoing through the records like echoes of a closed system. In some wards, the name remained, while the individuals changed, one generation replacing another, until the outside world forgot they had ever existed. Life for these children was claustrophobic in its simplicity. Their entire geography consisted of corridors, dormitories, and exercise yards bounded by high fences. They learned of seasons only by the light that shifted through barred windows. Holidays passed without recognition. Birthdays blurred into institutional routine. For many, the outside world remained a rumor, spoken of by staff, but never seen. The psychological weight of such confinement was profound. Some children grew into adults who never questioned their imprisonment, for they had no memory of freedom. Others resisted in subtle ways, scratching names into walls, hoarding scraps of paper, whispering family histories to one another as though preserving forbidden knowledge. In these small acts, they kept alive the sense that they belonged to more than the institution, even as the institution worked tirelessly to erase them. By the mid-20th century, files describe entire lineages contained within a single facility, grandparents, parents, and children occupying separate wards, each observed as a continuation of the same defective line. The effect was not medical, but genealogical. The asylum had become a breeding ground of captivity, ensuring that the label unfit perpetuated itself through confinement rather than through any objective truth. The tragedy of these children was not only that they were imprisoned from birth, but that their existence was used to justify the system itself. Their presence inside the walls was presented as proof that the eugenicists had been correct, that defectiveness was inescapable. Yet it was the institution, not heredity, that ensured their repetition. In some wards, surnames lasted longer than the patients themselves. The walls remembered the families, even as their descendants disappeared into silence, their lives confined to corridors where childhood, adulthood, and death all unfolded beneath the same roof. The promise of treatment concealed something colder. Within the wards of institutions like Fernald and Pennhurst, families marked as defective were subjected not to care, but to procedures that erased them from within. Sterilization was the most common practice, performed under the guise of medicine, but in truth it was an administrative measure. With each operation, a bloodline was cut short, a future erased before it could begin. By the 1920s, sterilization laws spread across the United States. Doctors became gatekeepers of heredity, authorized to sever what legislators called degenerate stock. Records describe the procedures in bureaucratic terms: operation completed, patient stable, prognosis incapable of reproduction. The language was antiseptic, but the reality was mutilation without consent. Many were children. Others were adults who could not comprehend what was being done to them. None were permitted a choice. Alongside sterilizations came experiments cloaked in the authority of science. Families institutionalized together were treated as controlled populations, their shared ancestry providing, in the eyes of researchers, the perfect laboratory. Injections of unknown compounds were administered, sometimes described in surviving notes as serums to test neurological response. Surgeries extended beyond sterilization, teeth extracted, glands removed, brain tissue altered under experimental pretexts. The goal was rarely cure. The goal was data. The documentation that survives reveals a chilling detachment. Charts list names followed by outcomes. Resisted injection, muscle rigidity observed. Post-surgery lethargy persists. No significant improvement, sterilization recommended. The individuals were reduced to lines of observation, their suffering recorded with the same distance used to describe laboratory animals. For the staff, the presence of gêneurs. Nations within one institution offered convenience. Genetic theories could be tested directly. If a parent displayed signs of epilepsy or intellectual delay, children were monitored for the same traits. When patterns failed to emerge, reports were adjusted to preserve the ideology. Defectiveness was assumed, and the experiments were arranged to confirm it. Some experiments extended into the realm of nutrition. At Fernald, children were fed radioactive oatmeal without their knowledge, under the direction of researchers working in partnership with outside institutions. It was presented to them as part of breakfast. In reality, it was a test to measure how radioactive isotopes were absorbed in the body. Consent was neither sought nor considered. The participants were expendable, chosen because their families had already been marked as lesser. The atmosphere in these wards grew clinical in its cruelty. Pain was not treated as suffering, but as information. Recovery was secondary to results. Families institutionalized for generations became unwitting test subjects, their bodies catalogued in reports whose conclusions were predetermined. They were not patients, they were data. Each injection, each surgery, each sterilization was not an act of healing, but of elimination. The institutions had transformed into laboratories of erasure, where bloodlines were not only confined, but dismantled one body at a time, under the cold light of science, distorted into control. Life inside the asylum was not defined by treatment, but by routine, mechanical, punishing, stripped of all dignity. The wards were arranged less as spaces for healing than as factories of obedience, where daily labor replaced therapy and silence became the currency of survival. To live inside was to endure repetition, each day indistinguishable from the last, each hour marked not by clocks, but by orders barked down the hallways. From early morning, patients were assigned work that bore no relation to their health. Men were sent into fields or workshops, their labor used to maintain the grounds and repair the very walls that confined them. Women and children stitched uniforms, scrubbed floors, and laundered endless sheets. The institution relied upon their work, but called it rehabilitation. In reality, it was a form of servitude, one that kept the machine of confinement self-sustaining. Disobedience was met with punishment. Survivors later recalled beatings delivered not in rage, but as part of the schedule. A child who refused to scrub floors might be strapped to a bench for hours. An adult who questioned authority could be placed in solitary confinement, the silence of the cell heavier than the walls themselves. Records mention behavioral correction, a phrase that concealed bruises, fractured bones, and the dulling of spirits. Silence was not simply enforced, it was cultivated. Patients were discouraged from speaking to one another, their voices replaced by the constant shuffle of feet and the scrape of work. Conversations, when discovered, were punished as signs of rebellion. In this atmosphere, memory itself began to wither. With no words exchanged, no stories shared, the history of what occurred inside the walls began to erode even before the records were destroyed. For the administrators, silence was strategic. It ensured not only obedience within, but invisibility without. Official reports omitted the labor, the punishments, the beatings. Files that did describe such cruelties often disappeared during audits, or were deliberately incinerated. The destruction of records was not a clerical accident, it was an extension of punishment, erasing the testimony of those who had endured it. What the body remembered in scars, the archive attempted to erase in blank pages. The daily rhythm of work and silence left marks deeper than wounds. Survivors described carrying invisible scars, the weight of years reduced to mechanical motions repeated without meaning. Some remembered the sound of silence itself, the absence of voices in corridors where hundreds lived side by side, yet rarely dared to speak. Others remembered the pain of hands worn raw from endless labor, or backs bent permanently from years of forced work. These scars were their journals, written not in ink, but in the body itself. Every day was recorded in scars, not in journals. The asylums preserved themselves by consuming those inside, their silence serving as both shield and weapon. In the absence of written testimony, the truth of daily life survives only in the recollections of the few who escaped, and in the void left behind by the countless who never did. If the asylum walls carried scars, the archives bore silences. In the decades when lawsuits and investigations began to surface, entire collections of records vanished overnight. Boxes of patient files, once stacked in orderly rows, were found missing. Case histories stopped mid-sentence. Registers that should have traced families through generations ended abruptly, as though bloodlines themselves had been erased with the stroke of a pen. The official explanation was always administrative: misplaced documents, accidental fires, routine purges to conserve storage. Yet the timing betrayed the intent. Records disappeared precisely when legal demands for evidence grew urgent. Attorneys seeking proof of sterilizations or abuse were told that the files no longer existed. Historians combing through census data found names that never reappeared in institutional registers. The void was too precise, too selective to be coincidence. The archive became a battlefield, truth against concealment. On one side were scattered fragments, stray intake logs, sterilization petitions, fragments of correspondence. On the other were the absences, missing years, missing families, the hollow spaces where entire histories should have been. What survived seemed almost accidental, as though truth itself had slipped through the cracks rather than been preserved by design. For the families, the erasure was double. First came the confinement, binding generations within walls. Then came the bureaucratic obliteration, stripping away the written proof that they had ever existed at all. Without records, their suffering could not be proven. Without names, their stories could not be told. They became shadows, unmoored from memory, denied even the acknowledgement of their erasure. Government involvement deepened the void. State officials ordered the destruction of outdated materials, ensuring that lawsuits would lack the evidence needed for conviction. Inquiries into sterilization quotas revealed gaps where annual tallies should have been. Correspondence between administrators and state boards was often preserved only in fragments, letters that referred cryptically to compliance with policy, with no attachment, no enclosure, no proof of what policy demanded. The silences themselves became incriminating. One investigator noted that certain family names appeared consistently in early records, then disappeared altogether, though relatives were still confined. It was as if the paper trail had been intentionally severed, leaving the families visible within the walls of the institution, but invisible in the eyes of history. The absence of documentation was not absence of evidence. It was evidence of deliberate removal. The result was a hollow bureaucracy, a system that appeared intact but was gutted from within. Where files should have preserved testimony, there were only gaps. Where names should have anchored memory, there were only blank spaces. The machinery of confinement extended into the archive, ensuring that those who were silenced in life remained silenced in history. The paper trail ended where the bloodline began. The disappearance of records did not erase what had happened, but it obscured it long enough for generations to vanish, unacknowledged, leaving behind nothing but silence and suspicion where proof should have been. Among the silence of vanished records and sealed archives, a few voices emerged, rare survivors of Fernald, Pennhurst, and other institutions, carried memories that could not be catalogued away, testimonies that outlasted erasure. Their accounts were fragile, fractured by time and trauma, but together they revealed a truth more damning than any government file. One woman, sterilized at the age of 14, recalled being taken into a sterile room without explanation. She thought it was a routine checkup. The next day, in pain she could not name, she overheard a nurse remark casually that she would never have to worry about children. Her words decades later carried no anger, only a hollow resignation. Her lineage had ended in silence before it began. Another survivor described childhood spent strapped to benches, punished for failing to complete chores that no child could reasonably perform. He remembered the rhythm of beatings delivered without emotion, as if they were another part of the daily schedule. Even in his later years, he could recite the sound of shoes in the hallway just before the blows arrived. What he remembered most vividly was not pain, but the absence of acknowledgement, the sense that no one would ever believe him. Fragments of memory often carried details the archives had attempted to erase. One survivor recalled the exact date stamped on the consent form her illiterate mother was told to sign. Another described the chalk marks staff drew on doors to indicate which patients had already been sterilized, as if humanity could be reduced to tally marks. These details, preserved in testimony, exposed the cruelty of a system that had relied on silence to survive. The trauma carried forward into descendants. Some families later learned, through half-whispered recollections, that their grandparents or great-aunts had been confined for reasons never explained. Others discovered that missing relatives were not buried in cemeteries, but in unmarked graves on asylum grounds. The survivors who spoke did so with the knowledge that they were voices for the countless who never left, for whom no testimony existed. In courtrooms their words were delivered with restraint, but carried undeniable weight. Judges listened as survivors described children forced to work in silence, as women told of being sterilized without consent, as men revealed years of labor performed under the pretense of rehabilitation. The language was simple, unembellished, but it stripped away the careful bureaucracy of the institutions. No chart or file could soften the reality they described. Their words were more damning than any government file. The survivors did not expose numbers, they exposed lives hollowed out by cruelty, generations denied futures by design. Each account was both testimony and indictment, proof that beneath the vanished archives, beneath the erased names, the truth had survived, in memory, in scars, in voices that refused to remain silent. In 1974, the silence of Pennhurst was broken not by reformers or inspectors, but by a lawsuit. Terry Lee Haldeman, a young woman confined within its walls, became the plaintiff in a case that would expose the institution to the scrutiny it had avoided for decades. What followed was not merely a trial, but an unsealing, a forced reckoning in which the hidden practices of Pennhurst spilled into the public record. The lawsuit, known formally as Haldeman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital, began with personal testimony. Haldeman described conditions long whispered about but rarely acknowledged: overcrowded wards, routine abuse, neglect masquerading as care. Her story was not exceptional, it was representative. Attorneys quickly uncovered a pattern of systematic violation, revealing that Pennhurst's purpose had never been rehabilitation. It had been containment, punishment, and silence. Court documents recorded in stark detail what witnesses described: children strapped to benches for days, adults left in soiled clothing, patients beaten for minor disobedience. Medical treatments amounted to little more than restraints and sedation. Staff shortages were chronic, with one attendant overseeing hundreds of patients. In this environment, cruelty was not incidental but structural, an outcome of design rather than neglect. As testimony accumulated, photographs and investigative reports entered the record. Images showed wards crammed with children rocking endlessly in filth, their eyes vacant from years of neglect. Experts testified that the conditions were not merely inadequate, but unconstitutional. Pennhurst, they argued, was a warehouse of human beings reduced to specimens, stripped of rights and abandoned in plain sight. The lawsuit revealed that this was not an isolated failing, it was systemic. Reports from the Department of Justice and independent observers confirmed that the same patterns of abuse existed across state institutions. Pennhurst became the symbol, but the reality extended far beyond its gates. The illusion of care that had shielded these places collapsed under the weight of testimony. Public outrage followed, but it was brief. Newspaper headlines declared Pennhurst unfit for animals, echoing the exact phrase entered into the court record. Documentaries aired footage that horrified viewers, momentarily forcing the nation to confront what had been hidden for generations. Yet the outrage, while loud, was fleeting. The institutions did not vanish overnight. Their walls continued to hold families whose names rarely reached the headlines. The eventual ruling in Haldeman versus Pennhurst declared that the institution had violated the constitutional rights of its residents. It ordered reforms, funding, and eventually the closing of the facility. On paper, justice had been achieved. In practice, the ruling came too late for the thousands who had already lived and died within its walls. The law confirmed what whispers had always known. The asylums were laboratories. For a brief moment, the archive of silence was pierced. The lawsuit created a record that could not easily be erased, a testimony preserved in legal documents that outlasted the destroyed files. Yet even this revelation was partial. What emerged in court was a fraction of the truth, a glimpse into a system whose deepest secrets remained sealed in missing records, unmarked graves, and families erased from memory. Long after Pennhurst's gates were locked and its wards abandoned, the ruins drew explorers, curiosity seekers and archivists, tracing the outlines of forgotten history. In the winter of 1982, one group forced open a door sealed with rusted bolts and plaster, a door absent from official blueprints. What they found beyond was not another ward, but a chamber constructed for concealment rather than care. The room was narrow, lined with cabinets, its air stale and heavy with the odor of mold. Dust hung thick, as though no one had disturbed the space for decades. On shelves, boxes waited, unmarked, collapsing under the weight of time. When opened, they revealed not medical supplies or records, but photographs, hundreds of them, small black and white prints, some curling at the edges, others preserved in yellowed envelopes. The images showed children, posed stiffly against blank walls. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary institutional portraits. Vacant stares, ill-fitting clothing, hair cropped short. Yet as the explorers spread the photographs across the floor, unease grew. The faces did not change. Over decades, the same expressions, the same eyes, the same proportions appeared again and again, as though time had repeated a single child in endless succession. Each envelope bore dates spanning nearly half a century. A boy photographed in 1932 reappeared in 1951, unchanged except for the style of the paper. A girl documented in 1940 resurfaced in 1967, her face identical down to the curve of the jaw. What should have been generations of patients instead resembled one child, photographed across decades, preserved like an experiment repeated endlessly. The explorers noted that the photographs were labeled not with names, but with codes. Letters and numbers replaced surnames, as if individuality had been deliberately stripped away. In the margins of some envelopes, clinic, annotations appeared, phrases such as subject stable, line confirmed, observe repetition. These notes suggested not treatment but study. The children were not presented as patients, they were catalogued as specimens. The sealed chamber deepened the claustrophobia of the discovery. Unlike the open dormitories, this was a space designed to hide rather than contain. Its isolation, the careful sealing of the door, implied that someone had intended these images never to be seen. The photographs became more than records. They were evidence of continuity, of a program that had adapted rather than ended. The explorers left the room shaken, their accounts later circulating among local historians. Some dismissed the photographs as duplication errors or misfiled portraits. But those who studied the faces closely reached a different conclusion. The repetition was too precise, the resemblance too exact. It was as though the asylum had manufactured sameness, generation after generation, and preserved it behind sealed walls. In a locked room, faces repeated themselves, generation after generation. The chamber stood as a ghostly archive, hidden within the institution itself, whispering that confinement had never been the final purpose. The program had not vanished with Pennhurst's closure. It had folded itself deeper into secrecy, leaving behind only a gallery of identical faces that stared back across time. In the aftermath of the sealed room discovery, a single folder surfaced that carried implications far darker than any photograph. It was slim, unremarkable at first glance, manila paper, its tab marked with a stamped title. Project Bloodline, Phase 3, Location, Classified. The date typed neatly across the cover was not historical. It was not from the 1930s, nor the 1950s. It was only 5 years old. The file's contents were brief, but their brevity carried a bureaucratic weight more chilling than pages of testimony. Inside were memoranda, lists of codes, and correspondence stripped of names. Nowhere did the documents mention patients or families. Instead, they referred to lines, subjects, and continuation protocols. The language was antiseptic, its detachment suggesting not a medical program of the past, but an administrative process still in operation. One page bore a typed notation: Phase 3 initiated, subjects confirmed, observations ongoing. The phrasing echoed the clinical annotations found on the envelopes of identical photographs, bridging the gulf between abandoned asylums and a program that had quietly endured. Another sheet included a chart, its columns labeled with decades rather than years, as if entire generations were the measure of success. The rows carried alphanumeric codes, repeating across intervals, as though the subjects themselves had been replicated. The most unsettling document was a memorandum stamped confidential. It referred to relocation of selected units and noted compliance with genetic integrity protocols. The location was redacted, replaced by a single word: classified. The implication was unmistakable. What had begun in state institutions had not ended with their closure. It had simply shifted behind deeper walls, hidden from both law and public memory. The presence of a recent date shattered the assumption that the Raws belonged solely to history. The survivors' testimonies, the lawsuits, the public outrage, all had been regarded as the final chapters of the story. Yet this file suggested continuity. The bureaucracy of heredity had not been dismantled. It had been refined. Families once confined in crumbling asylums may have been replaced by subjects monitored in locations the public would never see. The file raised more questions than it answered. Who authorized Phase 3? Where were the subjects now? What did continuation protocols entail? No document explained, no signature revealed responsibility. The language was designed for concealment, each phrase constructed to obscure rather than clarify. And yet, in its evasions, the file betrayed its purpose. Programs that required such secrecy were not remnants. They were operations. To hold the folder was to feel the weight of two truths colliding: the documented past of sterilizations, abuse and confinement, and the quiet persistence of those same practices into the present. The sealed walls of Pennhurst may have fallen to ruin, but the logic of heredity control remained intact, stripped of names, reduced to codes, carried forward under the title of Project Bloodline. The final document was not history. It was recent. It stood as proof that the obsession with purity, once confined to asylums, had not been buried with their closure. It had found new walls, new codes, and a new generation of silence to sustain it. The discoveries inside Pennhurst and Fernald suggested cruelty, but cruelty alone could not explain their persistence. To endure across decades with laws passed and lawsuits filed, these programs required something greater than medical zeal. They required sanction. The evidence, scattered but undeniable, pointed upward, to government involvement that transformed local experiments into national policy. The language of eugenics had long seeped into legislation. Early sterilization laws were not rogue practices, but statutes signed into law by governors, upheld by courts, and enforced with taxpayer funding. What began as pseudo-science in university lecture halls became embedded in state codes, granting doctors the authority to decide who could reproduce. The asylums were not aberrations, they were instruments of policy. By the mid-20th century, funding streams confirmed the alignment. Federal grants flowed into institutions under the banner of public health and mental hygiene. Budget lines described in vague terms, research, development, observation, masked the reality that entire families were being confined, sterilized, and monitored. Audits revealed gaps where accountability should have been. Entire programs were marked only as restricted, their details sealed from public inquiry. The classified file labeled Project Bloodline fit within this structure. It did not describe a lone doctor's obsession or a single asylum's hidden wing. It carried the language of bureaucracy, phases, compliance, relocation. These were not the terms of medicine, but of administration. The very redaction of its location, marked only as classified, betrayed the presence of government oversight. To redact is to acknowledge, and what was acknowledged was an operation of state. Survivor testimonies, once dismissed as exaggerations, found chilling confirmation in these documents. Their ounce of sterilizations, injections, and endless observation were not isolated cruelties inflicted by indifferent staff. They were parts of coordinated policy. Each scar was evidence not only of abuse, but of governance. The involvement of government extended beyond silence. Lawsuits such as Haldeman versus Pennhurst revealed not only abuse, but systematic obstruction. Attorneys seeking records encountered missing files, destroyed documents, and deliberate stonewalling. The erasure was too thorough to be accidental. It functioned as preservation, not of truth, but of secrecy. In this light, the institutions became something more than prisons. They were laboratories of statecraft, where policy was tested on the most vulnerable. The obsession with heredity, once argued in scientific journals, was enacted through law, enforced through funding, and protected through classification. What began as science became statecraft. The most disturbing implication was continuity. The closing of institutions in the 1970s and 1980s was celebrated as progress, yet the language of classified files suggested otherwise. Programs did not end. They migrated into new forms, hidden deeper within sealed budgets and redacted reports. The walls may have crumbled, but the logic endured, shifted, adapted, and concealed within the machinery of government itself. In the silence of archives and the vagueness of budget lines, the conspiracy above remained intact. Its power lay not in open violence, but in structured absence. The missing records, the classified designations, the denial of knowledge. What began as the control of families had become a policy of omission, ensuring that the bloodlines once targeted would remain silent in history and unseen in the present. The institutions are gone. Their walls have been torn down, their gates rusted shut, their wards left to collapse into ruin. Yet absence is not the same as closure. What remains is a residue of silence, of fear, of unanswered questions. Some walls were demolished, but the silence was never broken. For the families confined within, history ended without acknowledgement. Generations were swallowed, their names erased from records, their graves left unmarked. Descendants who search for them today find gaps instead of answers, files missing, archives sealed, census records altered to conceal who was taken and where they were held. The silence has shape. It exists in the blank spaces where memory should be. Among survivors' descendants, unease lingers like inheritance. Many carry fragments, half-remembered names, whispered stories of a grandmother who disappeared, a great-uncle who never came home. For some, the truth emerges only through rumor, that their bloodline had once been marked defective, that entire branches of their family tree ended not through chance, but through policy. The trauma persists not only in scars, but in the hollow absence of continuity. The archives that should have preserved testimony remain largely inaccessible. Some are locked behind government seals, others have been lost entirely. What does surface often arrives in fragments: a single sterilization form, a faded intake log, a stray photograph misfiled in an unrelated box. Each fragment confirms cruelty, yet each also gestures toward the enormity of what is missing. The scale of abuse is measured less by what is known than by what cannot be recovered. This absence has become part of the legacy. Institutions like Fernald and Pennhurst are remembered, if at all, as failures of care. But the deeper truth, that they functioned as laboratories for erasing families, remains buried beneath missing doc. Humans and silence testimony. The narrative is partial, always shifting, always incomplete. The legacy also persists in unease with the present, Classified files like Project Bloodline suggest that these practices did not truly end, but adapted, retreating into deeper layers of secrecy. For descendants, this possibility transforms silence into dread. If the archives remain sealed, it is not only history that is being hidden, it may be continuity. The residue of institutional abuse is not only trauma, but uncertainty. Families erased from the record cannot be mourned properly. Bloodlines severed without explanation cannot be traced. The silence left behind becomes a form of inheritance, passed from generation to generation, ensuring that what was done inside the walls still shapes lives beyond them. Some walls were demolished, but the silence was never broken. The ruins stand as monuments not to memory, but to omission. They remind us that what is missing can be as heavy as what remains, and that the deepest scars are those preserved not in archives, but in silence.